The 911 operator's voice was steady, but I could hear the confusion in her tone as she repeated back what my neighbor had just reported. "So you're saying someone is refusing to feed you at their own lake cabin?" I was standing on my deck, watching through the kitchen window as my wife Sarah explained to the police officer why she wouldn't give Karen Peterson the leftover barbecue from our family reunion. What started as a peaceful weekend at our generational lake cabin had turned into something I never could have imagined. And the worst part? This was just the beginning of Karen's campaign to destroy everything my family had built over 60 years. My name is David Mitchell, and for the past 15 years, I've been the reluctant caretaker of a piece of paradise that's been in my family since 1964. The cabin sits on 2 acres of pristine lakefront property, about 40 minutes north of the city, surrounded by towering pines and connected to the water by a private dock that my grandfather built with his own hands. It's not a fancy place by today's standards. The main structure is a modest 3-bedroom log cabin with a wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, and windows that frame the lake like living painting. There's a guest cottage my dad added in the 80s, a boathouse, and a fire pit where 4 generations of Mitchells have shared stories under the stars. When my parents decided to retire to Florida 3 years ago, they gifted the property to Sarah and me with one simple request: keep it in the family. We'd been coming up every other weekend during the warmer months and hosting the annual 4th of July reunion that had become a sacred tradition. The lake community itself was small and tight-knit. About 30 cabins dotted the shoreline, connected by a narrow gravel road that wound through the forest. Most of the families had been there for decades, and we all knew each other by name. There was an informal understanding about privacy, property lines, and the unspoken rules of lake life. That changed when Karen Peterson bought the cabin next to ours. Karen moved in last spring, a recently divorced woman in her early 50s who'd received the lakefront property as part of her settlement. From day one, it was clear she had very different ideas about how things should work around here. She introduced herself the weekend after she moved in, showing up on our porch with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Karen Peterson, your new neighbor," she announced, like she was running for office. "I think we need to have a serious discussion about property maintenance and community standards." Sarah invited her in for coffee, always the gracious hostess, and for the next hour, Karen outlined her vision for improving our little corner of paradise. She wanted to establish formal property line markers, implement noise restrictions, create rules about dock usage, and form a lake community association to enforce what she called appropriate standards. "Some of these cabins are really bringing down the neighborhood aesthetic," she said, glancing pointedly through our window at old Mr. Henderson's weathered fishing shack across the cove. "And don't get me started on the boat traffic. People just think they can do whatever they want out here." Sarah and I exchanged glances. The freedom to do whatever we want on our own property was exactly why we love this place. "We've never had problems with any of the neighbors," I said carefully. "Everyone's pretty respectful of each other." Karen's smile tightened. "Well, that was before someone with standards moved in." After she left, Sarah shook her head. "That woman is going to be trouble." I wanted to believe she was wrong, but the signs were already there. Within a month, Karen had attempted to organize 3 different community meetings that nobody attended. She left printed flyers on everyone's doors about noise violations after Mr. Henderson's grandchildren spent an afternoon laughing and splashing at his dock. She even called the county about our fire pit, claiming it was a safety hazard, which resulted in a very confused inspector making the drive out to confirm that yes, we were allowed to have a fire on our own property. But the real trouble started in July, on the weekend of our family reunion. This year's gathering was special. My elderly Uncle Frank had driven up from Texas with his grandson to see the cabin one more time. Sarah's parents came in from Colorado. My sister, brought her kids. In total, we had 16 family members scattered between the main cabin and the guest cottage, with a few of the younger cousins camping in tents down by the water. It was exactly the kind of weekend my grandparents had envisioned when they first bought this place, multiple generations sharing meals, stories, and the simple joy of being together in nature. On Saturday, we fired up the big outdoor grill for our traditional barbecue. Sarah had spent weeks planning the menu, her famous dry-rubbed ribs, grilled corn, potato salad, and enough food to feed a small army. The smell of hickory smoke drifted across the lake as 3 generations of Mitchells gathered around the picnic tables my grandfather had built decades ago. That's when Karen appeared at the edge of our property. She stood there for a good 5 minutes, just watching us through the trees. When my nephew spotted her and waved, she finally approached, wearing a forced smile and carrying what looked like an empty casserole dish. "That smells absolutely wonderful," she called out as she walked across our lawn uninvited. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by." Sarah, ever the peacemaker, invited her to join us. We made way too much food as usual. "Please, grab a plate." But Karen had other ideas. Instead of sitting down with us, she launched into what could only be described as an interrogation disguised as small talk. How many people were staying overnight? Had we checked the septic capacity for this many guests? Were we aware that the county had noise ordinances? Did we have proper permits for the camping tents? The questions kept coming, delivered with that same artificial smile, while my family members shot confused glances around the table. Uncle Frank, a man who'd never met a stranger, tried to engage her in normal conversation about the lake and the area's history, but Karen kept steering things back to rules, regulations, and her concerns about property values. Finally, my teenage nephew couldn't take it anymore. "Are you like the lake police or something?" he asked, with the bluntness that only teenagers can manage. Karen's smile disappeared entirely. "I'm someone who cares about maintaining standards in this community." The tension was thick enough to cut. Sarah quickly changed the subject, asking about Karen's own family and whether she had children or grandchildren who might visit. It was an innocent question, the kind of neighborly small talk you'd expect at a casual gathering. Karen's response was sharp and bitter. "My ex-husband got custody. Apparently, the judge thought a cheating lawyer was a better parent than me." She looked around at our multi-generational celebration with something that looked almost like anger. "Must be nice to have such a traditional family situation." An uncomfortable silence fell over our table. Even the youngest kids seemed to sense the shift in mood. "Well," Sarah said gently, "you're always welcome here. We believe in community." Karen's laugh was harsh. "Community? Right." She picked up her empty casserole dish. "I should let you get back to your gathering." As she walked away, I noticed her pull out her phone and start typing something. At the time, I assumed she was texting a friend or checking email. I had no idea she was documenting everything she'd seen for what would become a systematic campaign to drive us away from our own family property. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sarah and I sat on the dock watching the stars reflect on the still water. "Something about that woman just doesn't sit right with me," Sarah said quietly. "She's lonely," I replied, "and probably embarrassed about her divorce. She'll settle in eventually." Sarah shook her head. "David, did you see the way she was looking at us? At our family? That wasn't loneliness. That was resentment." Looking back, I should have listened to my wife's instincts. But in that moment, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the lake and the gentle snoring from the guest cottage where Uncle Frank was sleeping, I couldn't imagine how dark things were about to become. The first sign that Karen's visit had been more than social came on Monday morning when I found a printed letter slipped under our front door. It was typed in formal business language and addressed to the occupants of 1247 Lakeshore Drive. The letter outlined 14 separate violations Karen claimed to have observed during our weekend gathering, ranging from excessive noise levels after 9 p.m. to improper waste disposal practices to unauthorized camping structures on waterfront property. Each violation was numbered and described in detail, as if Karen had been taking notes throughout her entire visit. She claimed our family's laughter and conversation around the fire pit constituted disturbing the peace. She alleged that my brother-in-law's pontoon boat was improperly anchored. She even complained that our guests' cars were creating traffic hazards on the private gravel road that served all the cabins. The letter concluded with a demand that we take immediate corrective action to prevent future violations and warned that she would be monitoring the situation closely. Sarah read it twice before setting it down on the kitchen counter. "David, this is insane. She's trying to regulate how we use our own property." I wanted to dismiss it as the rantings of an unstable neighbor, but something about the formal language and detailed documentation made my stomach turn. This wasn't the work of someone having an emotional moment. This was calculated. "Maybe we should talk to her directly," I suggested. "Clear the air." Sarah's expression was skeptical, but she agreed. We decided to approach Karen that evening when we saw her outside tending to her flower beds. The conversation started civil enough. "Karen, we got your letter," I began. "I think there might be some misunderstandings about the weekend." She straightened up, brushing dirt off her gardening gloves. "Oh, there's no misunderstanding. I documented everything very carefully." "But Karen," Sarah said gently, "we weren't violating any actual laws or regulations. Families have been gathering at these cabins for decades." Karen's eyes flashed. "Well, maybe it's time for some changes around here. Just because something's always been done a certain way doesn't make it right." I tried a different approach. "Look, we want to be good neighbors. If there's something specific that's bothering you, let's talk about it." "What's bothering me," Karen said, her voice rising slightly, "is that some people think they can do whatever they want without considering how it affects others. The noise, the traffic, the complete disregard for property values." "Property values?" Sarah interrupted. "Karen, we're talking about families spending time together. Kids playing by the water. People sharing meals. These are normal activities." Karen's laugh was bitter. "Normal for you, maybe. But some of us are trying to maintain a certain standard of living here." The conversation went downhill from there. Every attempt Sarah and I made to find common ground was met with complaints, accusations, or thinly veiled threats about taking further action. Finally, we politely excused ourselves and walked back to our cabin, feeling like we'd just negotiated with a brick wall. "That woman has serious issues," Sarah said, once we were inside. "Did you hear how she kept talking about standards and property values? What does she think this is? A gated community?" 2 weeks later, we discovered exactly what Karen thought this should be. She had somehow managed to get the contact information for every cabin owner around the lake and had sent each of them a copy of her complaint letter about our family reunion, along with a new document titled Proposed Lake Community Standards and Enforcement Guidelines. The proposal was 37 pages long. It outlined restrictions on everything from the color of window shutters to the types of boats that could be docked to the hours when outdoor activities would be permitted. There were proposed fees for community maintenance, mandatory inspections for structural compliance, and a governing board that would have the authority to issue fines for violations. At the bottom of the document was a petition requesting signatures from cabin owners who supported implementing these necessary improvements to our lake community. I found out about it when Bill Henderson, old Mr. Henderson's son, called me at work on a Thursday afternoon. "David, what the hell is going on over there?" he asked without preamble. "I just got some crazy manifesto from your neighbor, lady wanting to turn the lake into some kind of HOA nightmare." You got Karen's packet too? 37 pages of bureaucratic garbage, Bill said. She wants to charge everyone annual fees and create a board to approve what color we can paint our doors. My dad's been coming to this lake for 40 years, and he's ready to sell rather than deal with this crap. Over the next few days, I heard from 8 other cabin owners. The reactions ranged from confused to annoyed to outright furious. Nobody, and I mean nobody, was interested in Karen's vision of a regulated lake community. But Karen wasn't deterred by the lack of support. If anything, the rejection seemed to fuel her determination. She started what she called compliance patrols, walking the shoreline with a clipboard and camera, documenting anything she deemed problematic. She took pictures of boats, docks, fire pits, and even people's clothing hanging on deck railings. She measured the distance between properties and claimed several of us had encroached on common areas. When Mr. Henderson's grandchildren came for their annual summer visit, Karen actually approached them while they were swimming and lectured them about proper water safety protocols and noise management. The kids were so rattled they asked their grandfather if they were in trouble. But the most disturbing incident happened on a quiet Tuesday evening in August, when Sarah and I were having dinner on our deck. We heard Karen's voice before we saw her, carried across the water from somewhere near the shoreline. She was talking on her phone, and her words made our blood run cold. "No, I understand the process," she was saying. "I need to document a pattern of violations before you can take action. Yes, I have photographs. Yes, I've been keeping detailed records." Sarah grabbed my arm. "Is she talking to lawyers?" We strained to listen, but Karen had moved further away, and we could only catch fragments. Something about property disputes and legal remedies and enforcement options. That night, Sarah and I had our first serious conversation about selling the cabin. "Maybe it's not worth it," Sarah said, staring into the fire pit where my grandfather had taught me to roast marshmallows 40 years earlier. "If she's going to make our lives miserable every time we come up here." "This is our family's place," I said, though I could hear the doubt in my own voice. "We can't let one crazy neighbor drive us away." "But what if it gets worse? What if she actually tries to sue us or something?" I didn't have a good answer. For the first time since inheriting the cabin, I was genuinely afraid not of Karen herself, but of what she might be capable of doing to our family's peace of mind. That fear proved justified the very next weekend, when Karen's harassment escalated to a level I never thought possible. We had come up for a quiet getaway, just the two of us. No family reunion, no big gathering, just Sarah and me, looking forward to a peaceful couple of days by the water. We'd been extra careful to keep our music low, our conversations quiet, and our activities strictly on our own property. Saturday afternoon found us grilling burgers for lunch when Karen appeared at our property line. She wasn't alone this time. She'd brought a man in his 30s, wearing a polo shirt and carrying what looked like an official clipboard. "Excuse me," she called out. "I need to speak with you." I walked over, Sarah close behind me. "What can we do for you, Karen?" "This is Roger Phillips, from the County Planning Department," she announced, gesturing to her companion. "I've filed a formal complaint about the unpermitted structures on your property." My heart sank. Roger looked embarrassed but professional. "Sir, I'm required to investigate any complaints about potential code violations. Mrs. Peterson has alleged that you have unpermitted camping facilities and possibly unpermitted additions to your structure." "What unpermitted additions?" I asked, genuinely confused. Karen pointed toward our deck. "That extension to the rear of the cabin. And those wooden platforms where people were putting tents last month." "Those aren't platforms," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Those are just level spots where the kids pitch their tents for one weekend. And the deck extension has been there for 20 years, I added. "It was built by the previous owners with proper permits." Roger nodded. Do you have documentation of those permits? My stomach dropped. The permits were somewhere in the stack of paperwork my parents had given me when they transferred the property, but I'd never thought to organize it or keep it easily accessible. Like most people, I'd assumed that existing structures were, well, existing and legal. I'll need to check my files, I said. I took the papers from the officer with trembling hands. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the basic message was clear. Margaret and the HOA had filed a lawsuit claiming that my occupancy of the cabin violated community covenants and local zoning laws. Until the matter was resolved in court, I was prohibited from living on the property. This is insane, I said, looking up at the circle of faces surrounding me. This is my family's property. I have every right to be here. Then you should have no trouble proving that in court, Margaret replied smoothly. Until then, however, you'll need to find alternative accommodations. The code enforcement officer, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, stepped forward. Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry about this situation. You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings. The property will then be secured until the court hearing. As I stood there, holding those papers, watching Margaret's satisfied expression, I felt something crack inside me. Not break, crack. Like ice under pressure, still holding together, but fundamentally changed. You have no idea what you've just started, I said quietly. Margaret's smile faltered slightly. Excuse me? Nothing, I said, turning toward my cabin. I need to pack. But as I walked away from that group of officials and HOA enforcers, I wasn't thinking about packing. I was thinking about the boxes of my father's papers in the back bedroom and the nagging feeling that I'd missed something important. Something that was about to change everything. I spent the next 3 days in a cheap motel 20 miles from the lake, surrounded by cardboard boxes and manila folders. Every surface in the cramped room was covered with my father's business documents, contracts, correspondence, financial records dating back 40 years. I was looking for one thing, the property deed that would prove my right to live in the cabin. What I found instead was something far more interesting. It started with a folder labeled BHD Core 1987-1992. Inside were dozens of letters between my father and various officials at Blackwood Heights Development Corporation. The correspondence painted a picture I had never known existed. In 1987, my father hadn't just sold some land to a development company. He had created Blackwood Heights Development Corporation. He was the sole owner and primary investor in the entire project. The letters told a fascinating story. Dad had owned nearly 2,000 acres around the lakeland that had been in our family since the 1920s. Instead of selling it all to outside developers, he had formed his own company to carefully manage the development of what would become Blackwood Heights. He wanted to preserve the natural beauty of the area while creating a sustainable community that would benefit from property appreciation. But there was more. In a folder marked Legal Ongoing, I found correspondence with lawyers dating from 1992 to 2010. Apparently, there had been a long-running dispute between my father and the HOA board that was established to manage the day-to-day operations of the community. The HOA had gradually expanded its authority beyond what my father had originally intended, and he had been quietly fighting their overreach for nearly 20 years. The final piece of the puzzle was in a sealed envelope marked Thomas Open only after my death. Inside was a letter in my father's careful handwriting, along with several legal documents I didn't immediately recognize. Son, the letter began, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've probably discovered that Blackwood Heights is more complicated than it appears. I spent the last 20 years of my life fighting to protect what we built there, but I was never able to completely resolve the legal issues. That task now falls to you. The letter explained that my father had structured the original development corporation in a specific way to maintain ultimate control over the community. While the HOA managed day-to-day operations, major decisions about property use, community standards, and development required approval from the corporation's board of directors. And according to the documents in the envelope, I was now the sole member of that board. But the real bombshell was in the last paragraph of the letter. The original Development Corporation Charter includes a provision that allows the board to dissolve the HOA and assume direct management of the community if the HOA exceeds its authority or fails to act in the best interests of A, property owners. I never used this provision because I hoped the situation would improve. But if Margaret Thornfield and her followers continue their campaign of harassment and overreach, you now have the legal authority to stop them permanently. I sat in that motel room until nearly midnight, reading through every document, cross-referencing dates and signatures, trying to understand the full scope of what my father had left me. It was like discovering a hidden weapon in an attic, something powerful and dangerous that had been waiting for the right moment to be used. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and spent 6 hours with a real estate attorney named Linda Chin. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in property law and corporate litigation. I spread my father's documents across her conference table and told her the whole story. "This is extraordinary," she said after reviewing everything. "Your father essentially created a legal time bomb. The HOA has been operating under the assumption that they have ultimate authority over community standards, but according to these documents, they're actually just a management company operating under the supervision of your development corporation. So I can stop them from harassing me?" "You can do much more than that," Linda said, leaning back in her chair. "If we can prove that the HOA has exceeded their authority, which based on your story, they clearly have the legal right to dissolve their board and take direct control of the entire community." The legal terminology was complex, but the basic concept was simple. My father had created a fail-safe mechanism to prevent exactly the kind of abuse of power that Margaret Thornfield was now wielding. The HOA was supposed to maintain property values and provide basic services. They were not supposed to harass individual property owners or make arbitrary decisions about who could and couldn't live in the community. "What's our next step?" I asked. Linda smiled. "First, we file a response to their eviction lawsuit. Then we file our own lawsuit, claiming breach of fiduciary duty and exceeding corporate authority. And then," she paused dramatically, "we serve Margaret Thornfield with notice that her reign as HOA president is about to come to a very sudden end." That afternoon, I got a phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Blackwood?" The voice was elderly, female, and slightly shaky. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell. I live at 247 Lakeshore Drive in Blackwood Heights. I heard about your troubles with the HOA, and I think we need to talk." Eleanor turned out to be an 83-year-old retired teacher who had lived in the community for 15 years. She invited me to meet her at a coffee shop in town, away from the prying eyes of Margaret's surveillance network. She was a small woman with silver hair and bright, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. We sat in a corner booth, and she spoke in hushed tones, like we were planning some kind of covert operation. "I want you to know," she began, "that not everyone in the community supports what Margaret is doing to you. There are quite a few of us who are disgusted by her behavior. Why hasn't anyone spoken up?" Eleanor sighed. "Because Margaret Thornfield rules that HOA board with an iron fist. She's made it clear that anyone who opposes her will become her next target. People are afraid." She told me about other residents who had been harassed by Margaret's enforcement committee. An elderly man who was cited for having bird feeders that attracted nuisance wildlife. A young couple who were fined repeatedly for their children's toys being visible from the street. a military veteran who was forced to remove an American flag from his front porch because it didn't meet the HOA's flag display standards. But the worst part, Eleanor continued, is how she treats people who don't fit her vision of the perfect community. Last year, she drove out a single mother who was struggling financially. The year before, it was a retired teacher who couldn't afford to upgrade his cabin to Margaret's standards. I felt a chill of recognition. She's been doing this to other people? For years, Eleanor confirmed. You're just the latest in a long line of people she's decided don't belong here. But Thomas, she leaned forward and lowered her voice even further. You might be the first person who actually has the power to stop her. Eleanor had done her own research into the community's history. She knew about my father's role in developing Blackwood Heights, and she suspected there was more to the legal structure than most residents realized. Your father was a good man, she said. He used to walk around the lake every evening, talking to residents, listening to their concerns. He cared about this place and the people who lived here. Margaret Thornfield cares only about power and control. As we talked, Eleanor revealed something that made my blood run cold. Margaret hadn't just filed the eviction lawsuit against me, she was also secretly working with a commercial development company that wanted to buy several properties around the lake and turn them into a luxury resort. She's been pushing out long-term residents, Eleanor explained, and encouraging them to sell to this development company. She gets a finder's fee for every property they acquire. Your cabin, with its prime location and direct lake access, would be worth a fortune to them. Suddenly, Margaret's campaign against me made perfect sense. This wasn't about community standards or property values. It was about money. She wanted to force me to sell so she could collect a commission and help her developer friends acquire the best property on the lake. But what Margaret didn't know was that she had just picked a fight with the one person who actually owned the entire community she was trying to control. I left that coffee shop with Eleanor's phone number and a promise that she would help me contact other residents who had been victimized by Margaret's abuse of power. But more importantly, I left with a clear understanding of what needed to be done. Margaret Thornfield had spent years using fear and intimidation to control people who had no recourse against her authority. She had gotten away with it because no one had the legal standing to challenge her. That was about to change. The court hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late April. Judge Patricia Brennan presided over a modest courtroom in the county courthouse, with windows that looked out over rolling hills that reminded me of the view from my cabin porch. Margaret arrived with two lawyers, expensive-looking men in tailored suits, who carried themselves like they'd never lost a case. She wore a dark blue dress that looked like armor, and her expression was confident, almost smug. She clearly expected this to be a routine victory. I sat at the defendant's table with Linda Chen, surrounded by boxes of my father's documents. Linda had spent the previous week preparing what she called the nuclear option, a comprehensive legal response that would not only defend my right to live in the cabin, but also expose the entire pattern of HOA overreach that Margaret had been orchestrating for years. But first, we had to sit through Margaret's presentation. Her lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Richardson, presented their case with theatrical precision. He talked about community standards, property values, and the importance of consistent rule enforcement. He painted me as a selfish individual who thought he was above the law, someone who was damaging the peaceful community that the HOA worked so hard to maintain. Your Honor, Richardson concluded, Mr. Blackwood has repeatedly violated clearly established community covenants. He has refused to comply with reasonable requests for property maintenance, and his continued illegal occupancy of a recreational structure threatens the integrity of the entire Blackwood Heights community. We respectfully request that the court uphold the eviction order and require Mr. Blackwood to vacate the property immediately. Margaret took the witness stand and testified about my various violations with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every word. She spoke about community standards and property values, about the importance of consistent rule enforcement, about how my presence was disrupting the peaceful nature of their neighborhood. Under cross-examination, Linda began to chip away at Margaret's testimony. Mrs. Thornfield, how long have you served as president of the Blackwood Heights HOA? 7 years. And during that time, how many residents have you initiated legal action against? Margaret's composure slipped slightly. I don't keep exact records. Would you say it's more than 10? Possibly. More than 20? I would need to review my files. Linda pulled out a thick folder. Your Honor, I have here documentation of 37 separate legal actions initiated by Mrs. Thornfield's HOA board against community residents over the past 7 years. That's an average of more than 5 lawsuits per year against people who live in a community of only 68 homes. Judge Brennan looked up from her notes. That does seem excessive, Counselor. But Linda was just getting started. She called Eleanor Hartwell as a witness, and the elderly woman testified about the pattern of harassment she had observed. She spoke about the single mother, the military veteran, the elderly man with the bird feeders, all people who had been targeted by Margaret's enforcement actions. In your opinion, Mrs. Hartwell, do these enforcement actions appear to be targeting specific types of residents? Objection, Richardson called out. Calls for speculation. I'll allow it, Judge Brennan said. Eleanor looked directly at Margaret as she answered. Yes. Mrs. Thornfield consistently targets people who are elderly, financially struggling, or who don't fit her vision of what the community should look like. She uses the HOA rules like a weapon to drive out people she doesn't want as neighbors. The courtroom was dead silent. Margaret's face had gone pale, and her lawyers were frantically writing notes. But the real bombshell came when Linda called me to the witness stand. Mr. Blackwood, can you tell the court about your family's relationship to Blackwood Heights? I took a deep breath and looked out at the packed courtroom. Word had somehow gotten out about the hearing, and I could see residents from the community scattered throughout the gallery. Some looked curious, others appeared worried, and a few seemed downright hostile. Your Honor, my father, William Blackwood, didn't just own property at Blackwood Heights. He created Blackwood Heights. He was the sole owner and founder of Blackwood Heights Development Corporation, which developed and continues to own the entire community. The murmur that went through the courtroom sounded like a wave breaking on shore. Margaret's eyes went wide, and her lawyers started whispering frantically among themselves. And what is your current relationship to Blackwood Heights Development Corporation? As my father's sole heir, I am now the president and only board member of the corporation. Linda approached the bench and handed Judge Brennan a thick folder. Your Honor, these are the original incorporation documents, property deeds, and development agreements that establish Mr. Blackwood's legal authority over the entire Blackwood Heights community. Judge Brennan took several minutes to review the documents, and the courtroom remained silent except for the sound of papers rustling. Finally, she looked up. Mrs. Thornfield, were you aware of these corporate relationships when you filed your eviction lawsuit? Margaret looked like she might be sick. No, Your Honor. I was not aware. Mr. Richardson, did your clients inform you of the corporate structure of the community when they retained your services? The lawyer looked uncomfortable. No, Your Honor. We were led to believe this was a straightforward HOA enforcement matter. Linda stood up. Your Honor, we move to dismiss the eviction lawsuit as frivolous and without merit. Furthermore, we are prepared to file our own lawsuit against the HOA board for exceeding their corporate authority and violating their fiduciary duty to the community. But Judge Brennan held up her hand. Before we get to that, I want to understand the scope of Mr. Blackwood's authority. According to these documents, what powers does the Development Corporation have over the HOA? Linda smiled. Complete supervisory authority, Your Honor. The HOA exists at the pleasure of the Development Corporation. If the HOA exceeds its authority or fails to act in the best interests of the community, the corporation has the right to dissolve the HOA board and assume direct management of all community affairs. The courtroom erupted. Residents were talking among themselves. Margaret was in heated conversation with her lawyers, and I could see several people pulling out their phones to make calls. Judge Brennan banged her gavel for order. Given the complexity of the corporate relationships involved, I am dismissing the eviction lawsuit against Mr. Blackwood. Furthermore, I am ordering all parties to participate in mediation to resolve the broader governance issues within the Blackwood Heights community. As we left the courthouse, I could see groups of residents gathered in the parking lot, having intense discussions. Some approached me with apologies and expressions of support. Others hurried away, probably to call Margaret and find out what this meant for their property values.